Karoline Leavitt's response will astound you. Liberal TV host fired for a single sentence on live television. There are moments that cannot be undone. A single fumbled word, an awkward glance, suddenly, everything falls apart. A single moment of nervousness and, in an instant, a whole career night. A massive audience tuned in for what appeared to be yet another mundane political debate. But minutes into the show, a veteran TV host who had interrogated countless politicians in the course of his career was concerned that things would quickly get out of hand. Career made a fatal mistake. He uttered something he never should have, and sitting across from him was none other. Initially, there was Karoline Leavitt, one of the country's rising conservative voices. It was just another heated debate. Tough questions, sharp responses, but then the pressure escalated. The questions became more aggressive. The host's tone, once measured, grew pointed, and then it happened. A careless remark, just two simple words, but powerful enough to shake the nation. The studio froze. Producers in the control room exchanged stunned glances. Viewers held their breath. But Karoline, she didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply asked, "Would you like to clarify what you mean?" That was it. And from that moment on, there was no way out for him. The clip of that exchange spread like wildfire across social media within hours. Hashtags demanding his firing dominated Twitter. Sponsors began pulling their ads. The network was thrown into full-blown crisis mode. By the next morning, an official statement was released, effective immediately. James Calloway is no longer employed by this network. A decades-long career dismantled in an instant. But this wasn't just about one host losing his job. This was about something far bigger. The power of modern media. The fine line between debate and personal attack, and the irreversible consequences of a single unfiltered moment on live television. So what exactly was said that changed everything? Was this a justified consequence? Or yet another example of cancel culture taken too far? Let's uncover the full story right now. It was a Thursday night, like any other across millions of screens. In American households, the American spotlight was about to air for many. It was just another nightly political talk show, a place where guests engaged in sharp debates. But for those who followed the political land, escaped closely. They knew tonight would be different. At the helm of the show was James Calloway, a veteran broadcaster, a household name, and a man who had commanded the airwaves for over 2 decades, known for his sharp questioning and non-nonsense style. He wasn't just a moderator, he was a force to be reckoned with. He had built a career on holding politicians accountable, cutting through spin, and refusing to back down to many. He was the gatekeeper of political discourse. And tonight he would face off against one of the fastest rising conservative voices in America, Karoline Leavitt. Karoline was young but by no means inexperienced, a former White House press secretary. She had quickly become a formidable presence in conservative politics, sharp-witted, well-prepared, and unshakable under pressure. She was not the kind of guest who could be easily cornered. The topic of the night is the media, truly. Fair, a simple question on the surface. But beneath it lay years of tension, mistrust, and deep political divides. A seasoned TV host versus a rising political star. Someone would win. Someone would lose. Behind the scenes, the air in the studio was thick with tension. The production team made their final checks. Cameras were set. The stage lights flickered on the show's signature intro. Music played, signaling the start of yet another night of debate. But in that moment, no one in the control room, no one in the newsroom, and certainly no one among the millions of viewers knew that within minutes they would witness one of the most explosive moments in live television history. The studio lights blazed, reflecting off the sleek glass table, separating the two central figures. Cameras moved silently, capturing every expression, every subtle shift in demeanor. The atmosphere was calm on the surface, but underneath tension was already beginning to build. Viewers at home were surely wondering, would this be just another political debate, or was it about to turn into something far more intense? James Calloway wore a thin smile, the practiced, confident look of a veteran broadcaster. He casually flipped through his notes, though everyone knew that each question had been carefully prepared in advance. Leaning slightly forward, his gaze unwavering, he began. Karoline, thank you for joining us tonight. I know our audience is eager to hear your perspective on an interesting topic, is the media. Truly fair. Karoline returned his smile, composed and poised. Thank you, James. I'm looking forward to an open and honest discussion. This is an important subject, especially in an era where information spreads faster than ever before. James nodded in agreement. Thought. There was something sharp in his eyes, an unspoken challenge. You're absolutely right. Information moves at lightning speed. But that also forces us to ask a bigger question: is the media really reporting objectively? Or has it become a tool for those with a vested interest? Karoline didn't blink. She knew. This game. Well, I believe the media should serve as a mirror to the truth, neutral and unbiased. But in reality, we've all seen that certain stories make the front page, while others are buried even when their significance is the same. James smirked slightly, as if he had been waiting for that very response. Are you implying that there is a systematic bias in the media? Karoline nodded slowly at this point. It's no longer an assumption. It's an undeniable reality. The way news is framed, the language used, even the choice of which stories receive attention, it all influences public perception. And that is not by accident. James tilted his head, his expression both intrigued and challenging. That's an interesting perspective, Karoline. But isn't it possible that the issue isn't the media itself, but rather how different audiences enter the news? Could it be that conservatives like yourself are simply searching for bias even when it's not really there? It was a sharp question, one that carried an underlying implication. Were conservatives playing the victim in a system that was, in reality, fair? Karoline didn't rush to respond. Silence, she knew, was often more powerful than words. She met James' gaze, then allowed a faint smile to form. If bias doesn't exist, then why do some stories get completely ignored, while others dominate headlines for weeks, even when their level of importance is the same? James held her stare. He knew exactly what she was getting at. Can you provide an example? Karoline gave a firm nod. I could name several. Take, for instance, the case of politician A, barely covered by mainstream outlets despite its significance. Meanwhile, a far less consequential incident involving a conservative politician was magnified and scrutinized for weeks. Is that fairness? James leaned back slightly, as if considering his next move. But in reality, he was shifting tactics. I see your point. But wouldn't you agree that conservative media does the same thing? In reverse, they also curate their coverage, craft headlines to fit a narrative, and shape public perception in their own way. So where's the difference? Karoline tilted her head, appearing thoughtful. I don't deny that some conservative outlets have their own angle, but here's the distinction. Mainstream media, those with the widest reach and the greatest influence, claim neutrality while actively pushing an agenda. That's what erodes public trust. James pressed his lips together slightly. Karoline had struck at the heart of one of modern journalism's greatest criticisms, the growing distrust of mainstream media. He glanced toward the production team. No one spoke, but he could feel the weight of the moment returning his attention to Karoline. Helly out a measured breath and smiled. You seem quite confident in your stance. But let me ask you this: don't you think conservatives themselves contribute to this erosion of trust by constantly insisting that they're being treated unfairly? Karoline's eyes remained steady. I believe that when a problem exists, speaking up isn't complaining. It's a responsibility. A second of silence passed between them, then James chuckled. Low, controlled, but it no longer carried the same confidence as before. All right, Karoline. If you're ready for a direct and honest debate, I won't hold back. The words were delivered lightly, but the message was clear. The gloves were coming off. James was no longer just moderating, he was challenging. And Karoline knew exactly what that meant. This debate had just entered a whole new level. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted what started, as the political debate was now turning into an intellectual duel. Both participants held their ground, but the tone of the conversation was changing subtle at first. Then, unmistakable James Calloway, despite his years of experience, was beginning to feel the pressure. Karoline Leavitt's precise, unwavering responses were testing his patience. He was no longer in control of the conversation. He was on the defensive, and James Calloway was not a man who liked being cornered. He clasped his hands together on the table and lowered his voice, slightly creating an illusion of intimacy. Karoline, you say that mainstream media is no longer trustworthy, that they manipulate information, but have you ever considered that conservatives do the same? They have their own platforms, their own news outlets, their own narratives. Don't you think you're criticizing a system that your own side is just as guilty of? Contributing to Karoline tilted her head slightly. Her eyes locked onto James. I've never claimed conservative media is free of bias. But the real question is, James, what's the difference? Conservative outlets don't pretend to be neutral. They openly state their perspectives. Meanwhile, mainstream media presents itself as an objective truth-teller. But is that really the case? James raised an eyebrow as if he had been waiting for her to say that. So, what you're saying is that all mainstream media outlets have a political agenda? Karoline offered a small, knowing smile. I don't need to say it. James, just look at how the news is presented. The headlines. They choose the images. They use the stories they highlight and the ones they bury. It's all intentional. James pressed his hands against the table, his voice carrying more weight now. But Karoline, don't. Conservatives do the exact same thing. They have their own news networks, their own headlines, their own narratives. Isn't the real issue not mainstream media or conservative media, but the fact that people seek out information that confirm their own beliefs? Karoline didn't waver. There's a major difference. Conservative media may have a bias, but they don't control the entire system. Mainstream media does. They hold an overwhelming influence on what millions of Americans here see and believe every single day. James' expression hardened slightly. So what you're really suggesting is that conservatives are being silenced. This was no longer just a question. It was an accusation. It carried implication. Were conservatives merely playing the victim? Karoline slowly nodded her gaze, calm yet unwavering. I'm not saying we're victims. I'm saying there is a system in place, a system that controls information, shapes narratives, and punishes anyone who dares to challenge it. James let out a short, dry chuckle, but the warmth from earlier was gone. You're describing a conspiracy. Karoline didn't blink. Not a conspiracy, just reality. A heavy silence hung in the air in the control room. One of the producers furrowed his brow and glanced at this colleague. The discussion was escalating faster than expected. But James wasn't about to back down. He leaned in slightly, his voice laced with sarcasm. You know, Karoline, maybe the problem isn't media bias. Maybe the real issue is that conservatives like you just can't handle the truth when it doesn't serve your interests. The energy in the room changed instantly. This was no longer a debate. This was a direct attack. Karoline let the word settle for a moment, but instead of reacting immediately, she calmly placed both hands on the table, keeping her eyes fixed on James. Are you saying we can't accept the truth? Or are you saying we refuse to accept a version of the truth that the media dictates? James narrowed his eyes slightly. He didn't like how easily Karoline flipped the conversation. I'm saying that if you and people like you truly believe in transparency, maybe you should question the conservative media outlets you support just as much as you question mainstream networks. Karoline tilted her head, her expression UNR, but her gaze sharp, and if you truly believe in transparency, maybe you should start questioning your own network for the first time. James hesitated. No one moved. No one spoke in that moment. The line between journalist and guest had vanished. This was no longer an interview. It was a battle. And James knew he couldn't afford to lose, not in front of millions of viewers. So, he made a decision he would push the conversation further. One sentence, one moment, and it would be the biggest mistake of his career. The tension in the studio had thickened, suffocating and heavy. In the past few minutes, the debate had shifted from an exchange of viewpoints to an outright confrontation. Karoline remained poised and steady while James Calloway was beginning to unravel, leaning forward slightly. His voice took on a sharper edge. Karoline, let's be honest, you and people. Like you always talk about media bias, about conservatives being treated unfairly. But tell me who really controls the narrative, who truly holds the power here. Karoline didn't rush to respond. She held his gaze, eyes sharp and unwavering. People like me. James hesitated for the briefest moment. He realized he had stepped too far, but instead of retreating, he pressed on. You know exactly what I mean. Karoline, conservatives, the ones who constantly complain about being silenced when in reality, they're the ones controlling the conversation. Karoline didn't blink. She let his words linger in the air, allowing their weight to settle over the room. Would you care to clarify what you mean by that? James intertwined his fingers, attempting to maintain control. But the tension in his posture betrayed him. The audience could see it. The producers behind the scenes could see it. He had lost his grip on the conversation, and that made him uneasy. I'm saying conservatives pretend to be victims when in fact they manipulate the narrative, casting themselves as the oppressed to avoid accountability. The studio fell into an eerie silence in the control room. A producer clutched his clipboard, eyes glued to the monitor. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone sensed that the discussion was slipping into dangerous territory. Karoline tilted her head slightly as if weighing her next move. But instead of arguing back, she let high statement linger, knowing that silence could be her most powerful weapon. Finally, she spoke, softly but deliberately. Are you saying conservatives don't contribute to society? James narrowed his eyes. This wasn't where he had intended for the conversation to go. I'm saying that. But before he could finish, Karoline calmly interjected. Because if that's what you're saying, then you're not just insulting me. You're insulting millions of hard-working Americans, people of faith, people who believe in traditional values, people who pay taxes, people who build, serve, and protect this country every day. The audience held their breath. This was no longer just a debate about the media. This had become a debate about identity, values, and what it meant to be American. James realized he had pushed too hard. He should have de-escalated instead. He dug himself deeper. Maybe if conservatives sped less time complaining about being oppressed and more time actually contributing to society, we wouldn't be having this conversation. His words landed like a bomb in the control room. The executive producer turned sharply to his assistant. Did he just say that? The assistant didn't respond. He just stared at the screen, watching. As Karoline remained completely still, she didn't react immediately. She didn't need to. She knew the damage had already been done. But just to make sure James couldn't walk back his statement, she asked one more time. Would you like to repeat that? James exhaled, suddenly aware of what he had just said. But it was too late. The cameras were rolling. Millions were watching. And the internet never forgets. I meant that if conservatives stopped fixating on the idea that they're being silenced Maybe they'd have more real influence in society. Karoline nodded as if committing his words to memory. So tell me, James, who exactly gets to decide who is allowed to have a voice? James didn't answer. Immediately he couldn't. And that was the moment everything changed within minutes. The clip of the exchange began circulating on social media. The key phrase, maybe if conservatives spent less time complaining and more time contributing, was stripped from its context and turned into the headline of the night in the control room. The executive producer ran a hand over his face. This isn't going away. Karoline didn't need to say another word. She simply leaned back, folded her hands, and let the silence speak for itself. James Calloway didn't know it yet, but at that very moment, his career had ended within minutes of the broadcast ending. Social media was in an uproar. A single clip, just a few seconds long, began spreading like wildfire. One sentence, one moment of lost control, and now James Calloway no longer owned his words. They belonged to the internet, analyzed, debated, and most of all, judged. News headlines flooded every major platform. Veteran TV host James Calloway. Maybe if conservatives spent less time complaining and more time actually contributing. Did James Calloway just say, conservatives don't contribute to society? TV earthquake. Can James Calloway survive the backlash? The hashfire. James Calloway shot to the top of Twitter's trending list. Alongside it came an avalanche of outrage. I can't believe a mainstream TV host would say that on live television. Absolutely disgraceful. So James Calloway finally showed his true colors. Is this what mainstream media stands for? Imagine if someone said this about a different group of people. They'd be fired on the spot, but not everyone was on board with the outrage. A counter-narrative emerged. Another case of cancel culture gone too far. We're destroying a man's career. Over one sentence, James Calloway has been in journalism for decades. One slip-up and his entire legacy is wiped out. However, what made things spiral out of control wasn't just the backlash. It was how the clip was edited across TikTok, YouTube Shorts, and Twitter. Versions of the video began circulating with context deliberately removed. The focus was solely on Calloway's statement. Maybe if conservatives spent less time complaining, with no lead-up, no response from Karoline, nothing to soften the blow. The more the clip spread, the more intense the backlash became. And then the sponsors got involved. The first company to issue a statement was a well-known corporate advertiser. We take our commitment to equality and respect in media very seriously. As a result, we are pausing all advertising on the American spotlight until further review within hours. 4 more major sponsors followed suit. Inside the network's headquarters, panic set in. Executives scrambled between emergency meetings. Phone calls were made, emails exchanged at a frantic pace. What had started as one heated debate had morphed into a full-scale PR disaster. In one corner of the office, a junior communications officer stared at her phone, watching the notifications pour in. A message from a senior executive flashed on her screen. We can't keep James Calloway. If this gets worse, prepare a contingency plan. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt remained silent. She didn't issue a statement. She didn't go on television to discuss the controversy. She didn't give any interviews. She simply retweeted the viral clip, adding nothing but a single thinking face emoji. That alone was enough to send the internet into another frenzy. This was no longer just about James Calloway. It had become a larger conversation about free speech, about media influence, about whether a single misstep should cost someone everything. And in the shadows of this growing crisis, one question loomed over. The network's executives, would they stand by James Calloway? Or would they sacrifice him to protect their brand inside the headquarters of the television network? Tension gripped every corridor. Emergency meetings ran back. To-back phones rang incessantly. Executives pored over live audience metrics, watching in real time as viewership plummeted and public backlash surged by. The next morning, the situation had only worsened. Major news outlets had picked up the story, not just conservative networks, but even some neutral and left-leaning publications. The headlines spoke for themselves. Has James Calloway gone too far? How will the network handle this crisis? The power of the media, who really controls the narrative. But what truly sent the network into full-blown panic wasn't the bad press. It was the sponsors initially. They had only paused their advertisements, claiming they were monitoring the situation. But after just one night, 3 major corporations announced they were officially pulling out. One media conglomerate released a statement. We have always supported respect and neutrality in journalism. After reviewing recent events, we have decided to terminate our partnership with the American Spotlight. Another corporate sponsor followed suit. We cannot continue to support a program where the host makes divisive and inflammatory remarks. These statements were more than just PR damage control. They were a death sentence for James Calloway, and now the network faced a decision of its own: stand by their veteran host or sacrifice him to protect their brand at 10 Chosei. An emergency meeting was held on the top floor of the building. One executive slammed his hand on the table. We can't defend James. Any more sponsors are pulling out. Viewers are turning against us. And if we don't act now, this show is finished. Another executive who had worked alongside Calloway for 15 years shook his head. He's been with us for decades. We can't just throw him away over one mistake. But there was no sympathy in the room. A senior PR executive spoke up, her voice sharp. That own mistake has turned into a PR catastrophe. He's not an asset anymore. He's a liability. A heavy silence followed. Then the decision was made. James Calloway would be fired by 3 p.m. The network released an official statement on its website. After careful review of recent events, we have decided to part ways with James Calloway. We thank him for his years of service and wish him the best. In his future endeavors, there was no apology, no justification. It was a clean break meant to distance the network from Calloway as quickly as possible. As news of his firing spread, public reactions split into 2 fierce camps. Some celebrated his downfall. A TV host can't just say things like that without consequences. This is a warning to anyone who thinks they can say whatever they want on live television. But others saw it as a disturbing precedent. Cancel culture at its worst. A man lost his entire career over one comment. Whatever happened to free speech? Meanwhile, James Calloway, the man who had once dominated the airwaves, had now been completely erased from them that evening. Reporters swarmed his house, eager for a statement. Former colleagues dodged questions, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. But James didn't emerge from his home. He didn't give an apology. He didn't go on television to explain himself. Instead, in the shadows of his downfall, he was planning his next move. And as for Karoline Leavitt, she remained silent. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply went back to doing her work. But after that night, she was no longer just a rising conservative figure. She had become a symbol. The James Calloway scandal hadn't just destroyed a career. It had marked a shift in the balance of media power. A clear message had been sent. No one is untouchable. But this story wasn't over, because when a man like James Calloway loses everything, he doesn't just disappear. He fights back. And that would be the beginning of a new war between the media and the public. 3 days after James Calloway was fired, the controversy still hadn't died down. Television pundits debated the fallout from every possible angle. Some praised the network's decision, calling it a necessary step toward accountability in media. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent, proof that anyone, no matter how powerful, could be destroyed by a single misstep. But one fact was undeniable: James Calloway's career in mainstream television was over. His story, however, was far from finished. On Monday morning, an unexpected message appeared on Twitter from James Calloway's official account. A short but cryptic tweet. The truth cannot be silenced. We're just getting started. Beneath it, a link to a brand new website. Those who clicked found a video. No flashy set. No studio lighting. Just James Calloway sitting alone in his home office staring directly into the camera. His voice was calm yet heavy with conviction. I lost my job over a single sentence. But this isn't just about me. This is about the real power behind the media. Who controls the narrative? Who decides who gets to speak and who gets silenced? If this can happen to me, it can happen. Tani Wan. He paused, holding the audience's gaze. But I will not be silent. I will say the thing they don't want you to hear, and I will do it my way. It was a declaration of war, and it was also the launch of the Calloway Report, an independent news platform under his control, free from network influence. Within hours, the website had received hundreds of thousands of visits. A growing base of loyal supporters rallied around Calloway, seeing this as a chance to break free from the grip of corporate media. But James wasn't the only one capitalizing on the moment. While public opinion remained divided over his downfall, Karoline Leavitt had solidified her own power in an entirely different way. She didn't make victory speeches. She didn't attack Calloway. She didn't go on a media tour celebrating his fall. She simply kept doing her job. But now every time she appeared on television, every speech she gave, every interview she participated in, she was no longer just another rising politician. She was the woman who stood her ground against a media giant and let him destroy himself. Her silence spoke louder than any words ever could, and in that silence, her respect and her influence grew stronger than ever. One media empire had fallen, but another was rising. The story of James Calloway wasn't just about a man losing his job. It was about a seismic shift in the media landscape, a testament to the power of the public in deciding who gets to speak. But the biggest question still remained. Would James Calloway succeed in rebuilding himself? Or was this a desperate attempt to fight against an unstoppable wave? Would Karoline Leavitt use this moment to cement herself as a major political force? And most importantly, was this the beginning of the end for traditional media's control over information? One thing was certain. This battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. And just like that, we've come full circle from a simple televised debate to a career-ending mistake, and ultimately the rise of new power players. But the most important takeaway isn't whether James Calloway deserved to be fired. It isn't whether Karoline Leavitt won. The real question is, what does this story say about us? About the media? About the power of the people? We now live in an era where one sentence can end a person's career. A single moment can be clipped, distorted, and shared at the speed of light, and even the most powerful figures can be brought down by public outrage. But is this justice? Or are we just spectators in a never-ending arena, cheering when one person falls only to forget them, when the next scandal takes center stage? The truth is, the media is no longer controlled by a handful of corporations. The power is now in your hands. Our hands. We decide who gets to speak and who gets silenced. But with that power comes a responsibility. If we only share sensational headlines without seeking the full context, if we only like and support stories that align with our personal beliefs while ignoring the facts, then are we really any different from the very people we criticize for manipulating information? James Calloway's story may just be one chapter in the history of modern media, but it's a lesson for all of us. So now we ask you, did James Calloway deserve to be fired? Or was this another case of cancel culture going too far? Did Karoline Leavitt really win this battle? Or is this just the beginning of a larger war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more stories that challenge the way we see the world. Thank you for watching. We wish you and your family health, happiness, and the wisdom to see beyond the headlines. See you in the next video. Disclaimer: this video is for entertainment, education, and inspiration purposes. Only the views expressed do not represent any political stance, organization, or individual. We do not intend to defame, insult, or harm anyone. This story is a fictionalized account based on hypothetical scenarios adjusted for the purpose of engaging. Storytelling. Viewers are encouraged to Think critically, research independently, and not accept any single source of information at face value. Thank you for watching.